Thank you, Naveed, and hi everyone. I hope that you're all enjoying your summers so far. So as part of our ongoing Summer of Action on UK Aid, Stephen, Ashley, Nicoletta and Jasmine in the London group spent a very sunny Saturday in July at the St Margaret's Fair near Twickenham in London. They spoke to passers-by at the fair about UK Aid and all that it's achieved around the world, as well as talking to people about TB and the upcoming HLN. Some of the people they spoke with wrote short messages to their MP to explain why Theresa May must attend the meeting. It sounds like a really great day, so well done to the London group for all your hard work in organising it. I know that the Edinburgh and Macclesfield groups are both busy planning events as well for August and September, so we're looking forward to hearing about how they go as well. If anyone else is organising an event, don't forget to let us know what you're planning, as we can send some of our resources that we've created on the UK Aid. As we mentioned on the last call, you can see the print files of these on our website, and this is on the web page for the May Action on the results website. If you have trouble finding them, just get in touch with either me or Naveed and we can point you in the right direction. Along with 4 other members of staff from Results UK, as well as Callum Kinsella from the London group, I attended the Results US International Conference in Washington, DC. For those of you who don't know, this is the annual international conference that's organised by Results US, where results staff and volunteers from around the world come together. There were people at the conference from all 50 states in America and 25 countries from around the world. It was very inspiring for me to feel part of such a motivated global movement to overcome poverty. And a real personal highlight for me was attending the International Conference Advocacy Day with the Indiana Results Group and speaking with US representatives and senators for the state of Indiana on both domestic and global poverty, and also attending a meeting at the World Bank on the issues of nutrition, education, transition and TB. I'm just going to pass over to Callum from the London group now, who's just going to share a couple of his highlights from the IC, from the International Conference.
Hi everyone, I'm Callum. I was just going to take up a minute of your time just to sort of briefly say a couple of highlights from me. I would say about half the time we were sort of learning about the results issues that you've just heard about there, and the other half was kind of thinking about how we can organise and recruit. And a couple of the sessions I attended, one was called Building Active Networks and the other How to Build a Movement. And it was kind of around the idea of really kind of listening to anybody who wants to become a results advocate and hearing their story and then sort of tailoring the ask for that person as appropriate and kind of getting to the heart of why they want to become a results advocate and what would be kind of a great role for them at this moment in time in their life. We also sort of heard from members of Congress who were real big supporters of results in the US, and one in particular, a former member, David Jolly, kind of mentioned that results is the most well-informed and respected activism organisations for international development that exists in the US, and that when we were going to this advocacy day, this would be the moment that they would hear about some of these issues like TB, for example. So it really kind of made it all the more important to make a real impact. And we've had some good news since then with some of the Congress people that we met signing on to certain letters that we asked them to encourage the administration in the US to attend the high-level meeting, for example. So yeah, it was a great day, and I've also got 2 blogs up in a 2-part on the results blog if you want to have a bit more of a deep read into that. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Callum. Yes, if you haven't already read them, I definitely encourage you to give the blogs a read. It's a great way to sort of hear more about what the Global Results Network is doing and hear what results campaigners are doing around the world. And finally, thank you to all of you who took the July action, which was to write to Theresa May on attending the TB high-level meeting in September. It's fantastic that people in her office will have seen your letters, which explain why it's imperative she attends this important meeting. Unfortunately, she's yet to confirm her attendance, but we know that your letters, combined with some of the other activities that Naveed spoke about earlier, will have helped to build up the pressure for her to attend. So thank you for your actions, and as always, we'll let you know if we hear any updates. As Naveed said, it's been yet another busy month, so thank you again to everyone for all of your hard work, especially over this hot weather and the summer holidays. So that's all from me. So I'll now pass that to Naveed, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Hannah. So now on to transition, the topic of tonight's call. Hello, someone trying to speak there? I'll carry on. We've had some new people join us. Welcome to those of you from Sheffield, and Rachel. Welcome to anyone new who's just joined us. As I mentioned just a bit earlier on, there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes activity on transition within DFID since our call in February. Some of you will recall that we asked you to write to the DFID Permanent Secretary, Matthew Rycroft, asking them to prioritise transition, publish a framework for this process, and appoint a director-level person to coordinate DFID's approach. Since then, we know that they have appointed a director-level coordinator and are developing what they're calling working principles for how DFID will manage transition, which is a really great initial result to your campaigning. And we're going to hear more about that, next steps on that a bit later on. So this is a really good time to hear from our guest speaker about the global context in which our own Department for International Development is developing its transition policies. She is Annalisa Prison, a senior research fellow within the Development Strategy and Finance Programme at the Overseas Development Institute, focusing on development finance. So, Annalisa, are you still on the call with us?
I am. Yes, I am.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to see if we can get you on the screen. Annalise currently leads research on country financing strategy, including transition finance, and the future of multilateral development banks and public debt sustainability and management. That sounds like a big portfolio to me. She's been part of teams advising strategy departments at both bilateral and multilateral donors, as well as at INGOs. Annalisa holds a PhD in economics and public finance and is an experienced researcher with field experience in many different countries, from Ethiopia to Fiji and Vietnam to Senegal. So a very warm welcome to you, Annalisa. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much to you.
So let me just introduce you, Annalisa, to who we have on the call. So we're joined by volunteer campaigners from all around the UK this evening, with varying levels of experience in advocacy, but all united by a passion for taking action to overcome global poverty. And we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and more importantly, we're then prepared to take concrete advocacy actions in support of sustainable transition. We've got 3 pre-arranged questions for you, and then we will open up the floor. For those of you on your computers, feel free to ask a question using the chat function. We will keep monitoring that, and that should be on the side of your screen. And if you prefer not to ask questions verbally, you can text them in, as we always do. The number to use this month is 07906 662 571. So that's 07906 662 571, and we'll be checking all of those to see what questions come in. So, Annalisa, before we do that, I wonder if we could ask you just to take a couple of minutes to describe what made you get involved in research on international development as an academic, and what motivates you in your research on these complex issues.
I mean, that was a really good question when Laura kind of raised that, and it was a good reminder, actually, why I'm doing that. And there are kind of different kind of reasons for that. I've always been interested in international development. I've always been volunteering in different organizations back when I was in Italy, but also in the UK. Now I'm grassroots volunteer for CAFOD, just to give you an example. But I was academically trained, went on to a PhD in development economics. And I think my main kind of goal is really to kind of separate the hype from reality. I think at this time of, we hear a lot of kind of fake news or not really well-grounded information. My role is really to kind of provide the evidence and help policymakers. You mentioned, it's been mentioned earlier on, I've been working with bilateral and multilateral agencies to inform their decisions ultimately. But the very kind of ultimate goal is not just about influencing policymakers for me, but it's really to kind of find the best way to make the very limited resources that we have in terms of aid, philanthropic assistance, to give other examples, to be as efficient as possible and as effective as possible. So I know that this is a kind of a broad objective, but that's indeed what's driving me at the moment in my research and advisory work.
Thank you. That's really amazing to hear that you're still, a real supporter of kind of volunteering at a grassroots level as well as your academic work. I like the way you put it about sort of countering fake news. We're going to go to the first of our questions. Annalisa just mentioned Laura, so I should also say that we also have Laura Kerr on the call. So that's Results' own Senior Policy Officer on Child Health. And Laura may want to add in some additional thoughts about the UK's specific aspects of transition where it's appropriate and may help to answer your question. So let's go to the first question. Before you ask your question, please just introduce yourself to Annalisa and say where you're from before asking your question. And I think the first question is from Paul, is that right?
Yes, hello Naveed.
Hello.
Hello Annalisa.
Hi.
I'm Helen and I live in Poole and I've lived here most of my life and I've been a results volunteer for a long, long time. The question we'd like to ask you first is, we do understand that the world is changing and that many previously low-income countries are now middle-income countries. What are the challenges that we're now seeing around the world?
I mean, thank you very much for the question. I mean, first of all, I would like to start by saying that transition and somehow moving towards a middle income status should be kind of taken as really good news. I mean, we should be kind of seeing that a kind of positive kind of change in the overall global landscape. I mean, it kind of reflects strong economic growth that kind of occurred across Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Of course, there are different challenges, and I would like really to kind of focus on three different aspects when it comes to this transition problem. The first one is a purely analytical, the second one is political, and the third one is primarily a financing problem. From an analytical kind of perspective, I mean, low income, middle income, and apologies if I use probably a technical term, but they were meant to be analytical classifications. So they were just meant for researchers like myself to create groups across countries. They weren't really meant to kind of inform decisions on how resources are allocated. However, they're being used for that kind of purpose. And particularly, I mean, the examples of Gavi, the Global Fund, this has changed over time, but there were the kind of premises. There wasn't any kind of, so to speak, hard evidence behind those numbers. And also these numbers are, first of all, limited because we know that the income per capita, if we think about I think friends and colleagues in London might correct me. I mean, income per capita in London is £29,000, but we know that this marks very kind of a different reality of those on a minimum wage and those that actually work in Canary Wharf. And the same applies to countries. So it doesn't really reflect income across people. I mean, the average income, it doesn't reflect how, I mean, develop a country when it comes to health and education outcomes. There's a correlation, but it's not necessarily that strong. So income per capita is just a kind of a very, very kind of narrow measure of development. And the second point, this is a very shaky measure. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, Ghana, I think if I'm not mistaken, 2014, and Kenya, slightly earlier, actually became middle-income countries overnight. You might ask why. It's simply because their statistical offices forgot to update, or better, they didn't prioritize the update of the numbers of the gross domestic product. They didn't take into account inflation. So it's also a very kind of vulnerable measure based on the assumptions. Let me go to the second point, which is one of the second challenge when it comes to transition and particularly middle-income countries. This remain, and I spoke with several kind of bilateral donors, and this is a very sensitive topic. You might kind of expect donors to have criteria to allocate their own resources, but primarily this is a geostrategic aid, and I'm oversimplifying that. Aid allocation really kind of reflects the geopolitical priorities of countries. I mean, particularly if countries are in the Horn of Africa, very kind of relatively important countries to kind of keep the stability of a certain region. There's also that kind of dimension. It is not just about income per capita or needs. And the third point has to do really with the financing problem. I mean, I can structure that in two different parts. I mean, if I have to be honest, when I talk about transition in the office, and colleagues are not here, but some of them behind me, actually, we have heated discussions around the issue of transition because the general narrative is about concentrating scarce, very kind of limited resources in poor countries. So why should a donor invest in a middle-income country when they can afford, potentially, have services, education services? But this comes to a kind of, the second kind of problem around financing, and then I'll stop here. Countries are not necessarily kind of ready when donors start pulling out. They haven't really mobilized enough taxes. They don't have sufficient capacity to afford those services. And that's quite an important point. Very final point that I forgot, and then I'll stop really. There's a general concern that as kind of countries move towards middle income status, they might prioritize kind of financing towards infrastructure development. Because the only option they might have when it comes to financing is just about loans. And very few governments are really happy to borrow for health and education because these kind of projects don't really generate returns, at least in the short term. And there's a general concern in parts of I think of researchers, think tanks, that there might be a kind of a shift of resources towards infrastructure financing. I have to be honest, in some of the countries we work with, these are the priorities that governments have. So we might kind of feel and might see that resources are diverted away from the social sectors, but some governments do express prioritization for infrastructure. And probably if we're really serious about the ownership of programs, that's what we need to take into account. And I really stop here. Sorry, it was a very kind of complex and interesting question, so it took me slightly longer than planned.
I think that's inevitable. We've chosen to campaign on a very difficult, complex topic that is well off a lot of people's radar. So thank you for starting us off to explain that. I think that set out really clearly for me, anyway, the challenges around using some pretty unreliable numbers to judge the abilities of countries to look after their citizens, taking into account the geopolitical realities of both donors and also the interests of national governments, which may not always be focused on poverty. So really thank you for setting that out very broadly. The second question I think we've got for you is coming from Oxford.
Hi.
Hi there.
Hi, so I'm Hannah from Oxford. So the second question is, from your research and visits to many of these countries, can you tell us some more about the reality of transition in countries when funding stops or changes?
Thank you very much, Hannah. That's, again, a very interesting question, and I might have too many examples, and I'm aware we don't have enough time, but I just want to give you a bit of an idea of where all this, a bit of a background. We've been actually working across 8 countries over the past year with local partners across Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. We wanted really to kind of get a sense of the implications and the impact of donors exiting, withdrawing their support. And I have to be honest, I mean, it's been mentioned earlier on, the country where the thinking around this kind of topic and importance of this topic was indeed Papua New Guinea. And there was a time actually back in 2014 where I spent some time at the Ministry of Planning, National Department of Planning. And one of the kind of key challenges was the issue related to the graduation from the Global Fund. And in particular, the kind of challenge for the government to step in and fill the gap that might have been left by the Global Fund. So there was indeed the main trigger and the motivation behind all this research project. So that's a bit of a kind of a start. I mean, what's the reality on the ground about transition? I mean, first of all, I have to be honest. I mean, across the countries we work with and on, it's not necessarily on top of their radar, if I have to be honest. So we talk a lot about the donor perspective, but recipient countries don't really kind of take into account this issue, don't really plan ahead. I mean, we ask if they have strategies in place, if they're factoring in the changing kind of financing landscape for them. It's quite rare. We have good examples in Vietnam, in Indonesia, but in other countries we hardly kind of seen that, apart from relatively technical documents within the Ministry of Finance, more to manage their own kind of external liabilities, but not really kind of strategic. So that's one of the key points. Also, donors, and of course, I'm sure Laura might kind of chip in at some point on the case of DFID more specifically, but donors don't really kind of plan well in advance their exit and withdrawal. It's indeed quite a rare occurrence. I mean, there are good examples, for instance, of Sweden in Vietnam, in particular, this is SIDA, that actually started a mapping of the activities, of their activities in Vietnam. We're talking about a transition that started around 4 or 5 years ago. Coordinating with the other donors, also identifying to whom those projects should be kind of allocated to, and also in early discussions with the government. But I have to say, this is quite a rare occurrence. Also, the reality on the ground is that that's what I call a herding behavior. So essentially, when a donor starts or decides to leave a country, also others might kind of follow. And there's not necessarily kind of communication on the ground about this kind of decision making, and in particular, which sectors donors are going to leave, when and how. So that's an important problem. It's about governments not being really well prepared, but also development partners not necessarily kind of planning well ahead. That's particular, and I'm sure Laura at some point, Laura, sorry for kind of mentioning you a few times, but I think that the kind of key area, if I have to be honest, across all the studies that we had over the past year and a half, has particularly to do with HIV/AIDS, and that's where several donors actually phased out and left governments to deal with that, successfully, less successfully, to a certain extent. Also, the other kind of important point I want to mention is that sometimes, and then I'll stop here, some donors actually do plan exit. There are, but they're not necessarily credible. In the sense they announced, I might kind of elaborate a bit more. But indeed, some donors do announce exit or withdrawal of programs, and after 15 years, they're still kind of very much active. So it's not just about having a plan, but it's also about being credible, so the kind of government can really prepare for transition. Really happy to kind of take also kind of follow-up questions, because I'm aware it's quite a tricky topic, and I can see there are some questions also coming in the group chat.
Thanks again, Annalisa. That's really useful. I'll just read out one of the things from the chat before we go on to our third preset question, which is Peter asking Peter from Stort Valley, how is the threshold between low and middle income set? And Laura has answered, it's determined by the World Bank every year in July. I'm going to move on to our last preset question, which was from Macclesfield, before we open up the floor to other questions. I know that we're going to get loads of questions in. So, Ricky, are you there in Macclesfield?
Hi, Annalisa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you crystal clear. Thanks.
Excellent. So we know that the Department for International Development is working on these working principles. And can you elaborate on why and how the working principles really matter, and how they help to make all the various services in these quite poor countries more sustainable?
I probably kind of missed part of the question, but being pre-prepared, I got a text in front of me to a certain extent, which is kind of I should do actually for the next phone calls I have too. But I mean, this is indeed good news, I would say.
Since February to mute me button.
Someone's got some kind of recording on in the background, which is kind of interrupting. If you can possibly turn that off, that'd be really helpful. Go ahead, Annalisa.
Perfect. So, I mean, very much kind of welcome the recommendation from the ICAI on different kind of approach to transition, in particular the introduction or kind of a plea and recommendation for principles to guide decisions on transition and how to manage the process. I'm trying really, and that was probably my role, to kind of step back a bit from the case of DFID, and particularly to kind of look across what the evidence, we were talking about evidence at the very beginning, which is kind of driving to a certain extent our work and our recommendations across donors. When is transition successful? What are the ingredients to make transition successful? First of all, the kind of key principle is around having criteria in place to determine when transition happens. I'm aware we talked about this is a very kind of political decision. There are geostrategic, geopolitical factors in, and I mentioned this is a very kind of politically sensitive topic, but there should be some kind of at least broad guidance to inform when bilateral programs should start being phased out. And that's a key kind of element. There are some donors that do have that. I mean, the European Union, for instance, have very, very clear guidelines on when transition happens and the characteristics of country when this has to happen. I'm not saying they're perfect, but certainly kind of articulate and clear for the recipient countries. The second kind of principle is having an exit strategy in place, and in some cases even during the country programs. I mean, even when country programs are agreed. But as I said before, there should be a kind of coherent approach when it comes to communicating when transition happens, which is leading me to the kind of third point. If I have to be honest, one of the challenges we have seen across the different examples of transition, exit, withdrawal, was that indeed the government at the different level wasn't really informed. I mean, it happened even to me personally, being at the National Treasury in Kenya right after the reclassification. It was July, I think back in 2015. And I remember this kind of conversations with National Treasury and the reclassification to middle income country status. And various senior officials were kind of expecting a graduation from the World Bank, from the South Window. I mean, nothing like that. I mean, this is still to happen. It will take a few years for this to happen. But the main problem is that the changes in the income classification weren't really well communicated. They were just kind of a statistical kind of measure. It's both at the ministerial level, but also at the technical level. And the kind of fourth point, and then I stop here, in terms of kind of principles or recommendations, I would say, from the evidence, is that the most successful examples of transition happened when actually not only there was a plan in place, but also when the handover was well planned. And it's not just about handing over to the government, which will be the kind of natural endpoint of transition. But it's also about involving other development partners who will stay in the country. There are several donors that don't really leave the country when it becomes a middle income country at all. In some cases, they're also scaling up resources. But it's really kind of identifying who best among donors can take over, and also moving into regional programs. So it's not necessarily being having only kind of country level programs, but it's about kind of joining forces with other countries and kind of extend beyond the kind of borders of the country. So I would say 4 main principles around kind of having criteria in place, planning the exit even at the time of the country programs. This was also the case, particularly on Denmark in India, and that was quite a successful case. Communicating at all levels the transition will take place, and finally managing the handover, not just leaving full stop.
Thanks, Annalisa. You set out some really, I think, clear overall challenges for donors and governments in terms of their preparedness for transitions. Ricky's questions about how that translates, I think, into the principles that DFID wants to develop. So I'm going to ask Laura if she can chip in here. You mentioned a couple of times. Before you do, there's a question in the chat box, a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one, actually, which is relevant to this specific point. So Jill is asking, what specific progress since February has been made by DFID in managing transition that we could people could refer to in their letters? So, Laura, do you want to chip in there? And sorry, I was also just saying we then got a comment from Ricky. It's clear that the working principles are badly needed, and how successful will DFID and others be in implementing those? So, if Laura first, then maybe back to Annalisa on the second one, because that sounds like it's challenges that and other donors may also have been facing.
Yeah. Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I unfortunately put a washing on at very bad timing, so if you can't hear me over that, let me know. Just to say, I don't really have very much to add on top of what Annalisa said, like so excellently articulated that badly need why we need the principles, and from Results UK's perspective, it is about that predictability and the ability of countries to plan. You know, we're concerned in a lot of these countries, no matter what kind of income status they're at, you know, still have vast inequalities in their health services. Nigeria is going through multiple transitions just now, but has the highest number of children who are unimmunised, as well as the most number of people living in poverty. And if a country is trying to tackle those inequalities and raising budgets to tackle those, if they're not in a position where they can plan also for the fact that donors are decreasing their financing because they've not been told or they've not been aware and haven't had time to plan. And that's kind of at the crux of what we're kind of worried about. It's about the health services that don't exist just now and the ones in the future that, you know, if that money disappears, what services won't be able to be delivered anymore. So working principles, they matter for us because it's about the kind of the service delivery and tackling the inequalities that we want to reach certain aspects of the SDGs. But just to say from a UK specific perspective, I think you're going to ask Naveed around the principles. To say, Jill, since February 2018, we've heard, and we didn't know until after your action, that there is a director person being elected. Sorry, too late in the day. There's a director person being appointed, so they will be in control of what DFID does on transitions. We know this is really important at this time because by the end of this year, the government are going to be undertaking a spending review, which will determine what countries they're kind of supporting. And for us, we will really need there to be principles in place to help guide those decisions so that they're not just made on those economic indicators. And for us, the UK has a very big voice on the Gavi board and the Global Fund board and many other decision-making bodies. And we know the positions that they have there, but we don't know whether what they're saying on one decision-making body is the same as the other, and if that aligns with their bilateral programs as well. So we really need those principles so that we can really understand, you know, why are they making the decisions that they are? How do we make sure they're making them uniformly? And how do we make sure those decisions are informed well beyond looking at those indicators, beyond Jane and I taking into account all those excellent points that Annalise has already shared.
Cool, thanks, Laura. We've got 15 minutes left of the call. We've covered an awful lot of ground so far. I'm gonna open the floor to calls, to questions in verbal questions, sorry. Obviously, as you've heard already, this is a very multifaceted issue, very complex, different in different countries. And I know particularly for those of you who may be newer to this issue or newer to results, please do ask basic questions. We've covered a lot of the minutiae of the way that an international donor works, and the basic questions are often the very good ones. And if you've got a question in your mind that you don't understand something, there are no stupid questions. Please ask. So I'm just going to open up to the floor on that basis before maybe taking some of the points that have been come up in the chat box and online on the text. So anyone just unmute and ask a question. So people are submitting their questions in the chat. So let's go to one of those. And again, if anyone wants to pipe up and ask a point of clarification, please do. So the first question here I have is from Paul, coming on the text. Is there a danger of creating yo-yo countries which sink back quickly to becoming low income? And that's from Harriet in Poole.
I mean, if I may, I mean, it happened indeed. I mean, there was, I mean, there are some good examples. I mean, South Sudan, unfortunately, we know there's a civil war. They had highly kind of reliant on oil. There was a yo-yo country. I mean, if I can, there was a fantastic expression. Senegal was one of them. I mean, actually set to kind of move away from grants, loans, even more kind of expensive ones. But that's, I mean, and this kind of actually offers me the opportunity to elaborate a bit more around this kind of criteria. And it was mentioned earlier on also the concept of readiness. So income per capita is a very easy way to classify countries. I mean, that's inevitable. But as we said, this is a very kind of limited measure. So most kind of, if I think about the World Bank, the African Development Bank, certainly they do rely, first of all, on per capita income as a way to kind of trigger that kind of withdrawal process. It's more technical. It's about changing, becoming more expensive kind of lending. But there are other factors that are taken into account to correct for the limitations of income per capita. They take into account the fiscal position, the inflation, also poverty levels, human development indicators. The problem about that is this is a very murky process. So we know a lot about income per capita, but only if you're inside the organization. Even if you're inside the organization, believe me, because I work for some of these organizations before, unless you're kind of working directly, you don't really know the criteria that are applied in the detail. You know somehow the parameters, but just I want to leave the sense that when the multilateral organizations take decisions is not just about income per capita. And also Gavi, the Global Fund, introduced other indicators to correct that. But Gavi and Global Fund are largely driven by income per capita.
Thanks, Annalisa. We've got two really good questions coming on the chat box, and I really hope we've got time to cover those, and one or two more if possible. The first one I'm going to read out because not everyone can see these questions, It's from Peter again in Stork Valley. Who is the highest level entity that could have an overview over transition and lead on supporting better planning? And I don't know if that's a global or a UK question. You may want to take it as both.
No, this is indeed a fantastic question, and now that I'm also thinking about the recommendations of the report, we might kind of think very. Oh, sorry, Peter. Probably you wanted to kind of speak.
I just said global.
Global, okay, good. Well, global. That's indeed quite a good question. I mean. Let me just take it from the kind of country level, and then I move into the global level, if that's okay. At the kind of country level, I mean, I'm just moving around, sorry, because that might be, it might kind of get dark behind me as I'm the only one on the floor. But there's a kind of key element at the country level. I mean, if, I'll give you the example of the UK, if DFID assistance is withdrawn from Vietnam, and that's what happened, it doesn't mean that the UK won't engage with Vietnam any longer with development cooperation programs, or more broadly with economic programs. This takes place by climate change funds, by the FCO. So it's not just about DFID, it's a much kind of broader kind of discussion. In the UK, there's not necessarily kind of a body coordinating all these kind of responses. I mean, this is a kind of part of the government function. In other countries, there are interministerial committees deciding on aid allocation and coordination across the agency, and that's what happens usually. There's no kind of strategic, I mean, thinking about transition per se, or when we leave a country, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs leaves the country, what can the others do? I mean, Ministry of Trade and others. It's not such a strategic kind of thinking. But there is a body that can take potentially those kind of decisions. Sorry, I need to move around. That's the only way I can get some.
Take your time, that's fine.
Sorry about that.
I
need to move around, otherwise I will get, yes, and light is back. That's a way of saving light at ODI. So apologies for that. So at the country level, that's potentially a kind of a solution. I haven't really thought about it at the global level, simply because, I mean, this might kind of happen, for instance, across the multilateral development banks. That might be a possibility. I suspect this might be a kind of a challenge across bilateral donors. And the simple reason is that they hardly coordinate their own responses. We have targets around allocating more resources to least developed countries, and they're not fulfilled and they are unmet. And again, there are some donors, I mean, I'll give you an example, the Koreans, for instance, they will continue operating in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, no matter the income per capita level. Donors do have very different priorities. And of course, the geopolitical, strategic decisions do come into play quite strongly. So to cut a long answer very short, I would say there are ways to kind of coordinate within a donor, I mean, within the kind of government system of a donor. I feel it might be quite challenging and unrealistic when it comes to bilateral organizations, but not necessarily for the multilateral development banks, I would say.
Thank you.
There's a wonderful question coming on the chat from Kathy in Edinburgh, and I'm not sure I understand the question. I think I do, but Annalise, I hope you will have something to help us with on this one. She says, as there is no incentive for a country to plan for transition, since they're going to lose donors, what can be done or what is done to incentivize a country to make a good transition plan?
That's a really good question, actually. And I think that's probably in the mind of several donors. I mean, we need to recall that, I mean, there are countries that do take pride in transition. I mean, I remember when I started working in international development, or better, when I moved to London, which is at the beginning of this decade. I mean, there were strong movements towards ending dependency on aid. I remember some of us might kind of remember quite clearly the case of India that actually kicked out most of the bilateral donors. Rwanda is another kind of example. So there are countries that take pride, now it's happening with Vietnam, about kind of ending or kind of reducing the dependency on aid. So that's quite a key point. The other point, I mean, I'm saying something very boring for late evening, but there is a key point donors should help when it comes to kind of transition, which is a kind of building fiscal capacity. I know that this is not a sexy topic. This is not about helping children directly. It's very boring working with Minister of Finance, and I tell you by experience. But it's certainly the kind of a key area to kind of create those buffers and the capacity to self-sustain. And it's also about kind of taking decisions. I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, again, for those that have been working on international development for a while, there's a key word when it comes to the principles of development effectiveness, which is ownership. Donors, of course, need to kind of develop programs where the recipient countries are in the driving seat. But it's only when governments can allocate, I mean, I'm talking about recipient governments, can allocate their own resources. That's the kind of, that's where ownership is really kind of, I mean, is very much kind of at the heart of development. Sorry, it's becoming late in the day, so my kind of vocabulary is kind of fading away.
Don't worry. Thank you for that. So we've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to try and keep us as far close to time as possible and respect the time that you've got in the remainder of your evenings. So we've got one last question coming on the chat box, which I suspect will need longer than we've got, but if there's possible to give a very punchy answer. Results Norwich have asked, if donor countries stall in implementing frameworks for transition, is there a possibility that private investment might take over, which could lead to greater inequality?
Again, this is a very good question. I mean, there are governments have kind of relied on international capital markets because actually, to a certain extent, they wanted to kind of showcase they can borrow, first of all, but also because they needed more resources and they weren't coming from the traditional development partners. So they didn't want to kind of be under the policy conditionality of donors. So this has happened. There are examples in railways in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, Kenya, just to cite a couple of examples. It's not necessarily, I mean, I'm probably somehow more neutral when it comes to the role of private investors. I don't see necessarily as the kind of evil in the equation. So not necessarily kind of them coming in, bringing inequality or kind of determining, making somehow incomes less equal. The only kind of answer I can give is certainly that governments did look for private investors when traditional aid wasn't really available.
Thank you, Annalisa. That's a really concise answer to as obviously that could take us, we could have a whole call just on that topic alone, I'm sure. Where do countries get their development financing from? I just think that's all we've got time for tonight now. This is clearly a mega complex topic. It's actually a multifaceted range of different topics, and it's clear from people's questions that there's a lot of people engaging with this at a really high level, and thank you very much for sticking with us, because we believe that this is, although it's complex, it is really important to get this right and to get this amalgam of problems dealt with correctly, which is why we're focusing on principles. If you look at this month's action materials, We're asking you to follow up your letters to Matthew Rycroft with another letter, asking him to clarify what these working principles on transition will be, making sure that they're about sustainability and focusing on the impact of people's access to health services. That's the bottom line, people being able to keep on gaining the benefits of development that might otherwise be lost through poor planning. It's, as I think Annalise mentioned, doesn't sound like a sexy topic, but it's really important. And it's a topic that really isn't on many other people's radar right now. So we're convinced that in spite of these complexities, that you'll be able to not only explain why this matters for people's access to those vital health services, but also that through this advocacy, you'll be able to have a significant impact on government policy in this area and make a real difference to the way that transitions are managed by DFID. So very best of luck. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Annalisa for joining us tonight and for sharing us, staying late in the office, so late that it's getting the lights are going off, and for sharing with us your global perspective on transitions. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you do have any questions, things that you haven't quite followed, you can go and look at our action materials. You can call in the office and we'll get the answer to you that you need. So thank you for all your support as always. I'm going to sign off now, and best of luck and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.